let me know if you want this fin. Sorry.
Good to go? Cool, all right. Thank you everyone for coming. We're here today to talk about how we do documentation within the OpenStack project. Pretty much kind of a historical view, bringing us all the way up to what we're doing today and what we're planning on doing going forward. Yep, you can keep skipping.
It's going real slow. There we go.
There we go. Cool. All right. So past view where we've kind of come from. Documentation project has obviously been around since the beginning of OpenStack itself. We're going to look then at what we're doing today, and then we're going to kind of talk about where we see ourselves going in the next couple of years. But before we do that, we should probably introduce ourselves. So my name's Stephen. For anyone that doesn't know me, I mostly work on Nova, but I'm pretty much spread across the entire OpenStack ecosystem. So I'm also working on Oslo, and since about 2016, I've been fairly heavily involved in docs, leading to me becoming the doc PTL for the train release.
And I'm Alex, for those who don't know me. I am currently serving on the TC as the vice chair, and I've previously been the documentation PTL, so that's where I fit in. I currently work for SUSE as a technical writer as well, so documentation is my thing. All right, let's kickstart on where we've come from. So we sort of want to take a bit of a step back, because understanding where we are now and where we're going is all to do with where we've been. Okay, so I began working on the documentation around 2014 as a Rackspace employee. The documentation at this time was written in DocBook XML, so it looks like this, which is what's on the screen. And the documentation solely existed in the OpenStack manuals repo, so we owned everything. 2014 was around the time of the Kilo and Liberty releases, so we're getting fairly well established at this point. The PTO was Anne Gentle, who actually founded the OpenStack documentation set around the Bexar release, and then it was followed up by Lana Brindley, who is another Rackspace employee. So it was fairly Rackspace heavy, and I mean, that's made sense at the time. Next slide. So our team actually consisted of 246 individual contributors and 211 individual reviewers. At this point in time, our top company contributors and reviewers were actually independent from SUSE, Rackspace, or the OpenStack Foundation. So we had a fair level of diversity, but it was quite heavy in a few select areas. Right, so 2014 though, we had some massive changes to kickstart. We actually decided to move away from DocBook XML and convert everything into RST, so restructured text. One of the challenges that our team faced was, and continue to face actually, is a lack of human resources. And this is not unique at all to the OpenStack Manuals project. It tends to just be a little bit more highlighted because documentation is across all projects. And without docs, you don't know how a certain project works, especially with something so complicated as OpenStack. So we decided to work a little bit more towards dev-driven documentation. So switching to a Markdown was a bit more amenable, and we all agreed on RST just because it had a little bit more diversity in its structure. So we actually started converting manually. We used Pandoc to run a script and convert everything, and then we went through it all more or less manually. So we started with the installation guides in the Liberty release. The rest of the guides followed in Mitaka, and then DocBook support was fully removed by Newton. So this is where things slightly started deteriorating. So early 2017, I was the PTL for docs. This was the Pike release, and a large portion of our contributor base was no longer dedicated to the project by no fault of their own. And many were no longer at all working for OpenStack. So the amount of commits to the OpenStack manuals repo, or people that were willing to commit, dropped significantly. So to look at this, we have Ocado, there was 192 individual contributors. Pike, there's 167, and by Queens, there was only 69. That's an enormous jump in 18 months. So these numbers were fairly indicative of the changes we'd implemented though, during and after the Pike release. But after two major external parties, so companies, had actually pulled out. And that was the key source of the major problem. We were unable to manage the documentation as it existed. So one team had looked after everything, and all of a sudden we didn't even have a team to do that. So the topic was brought up, how are we going to deal with this? This is a massive problem. we write documentation for the whole project. How are 5 people going to manage that? So in Ocado, we'd separated the guides by distribution, and by Pike, we separated the install guides with distro-specific info available in the guides and put them in the project repositories. So, enter the project migration plan. So this is something myself, Doug Hellman, Stephen worked on extensively. Basically, as the documentation team started rapidly losing contributors and core reviewers, it became increasingly hard to manage documentation as it was. So until this point, the documentation team had owned and managed several guides, including install, admin, user, networking, and security, which are highly specialized content that we just couldn't manage on our own. So we would propose we'd actually invert the relationship of the documentation. So previously we would have developers that were liaisons to the documentation team, and they would help us test and verify the documentation. We decided to switch that. The documentation would live in the project repositories, and the documentation team became liaisons to them instead. So we still existed as a team and an official project team at this point. So as part of this proposal, we developed a full technical solution to the problem, defining how the documentation we built, managed, and structured within the project teams. So it was a large undertaking. It wasn't just shift and lift. All right, Stephen.
That brings us to where we are today. So our entire documentation build, regardless of which project you work on, is all written in restructured text, and it's all built with Sphinx. So Sphinx literally everywhere within OpenStack. As Alex noted earlier, this was a conscious decision made a couple of years ago, mostly to encourage developers to start contributing documentation as opposed to purely tech writers. DocBook was seen as something that had a far too significant barrier to entry, unless you were actually working and writing this stuff on a day-to-day basis. Sphinx itself was chosen over some other tools for a couple of reasons. One of the big advantages of it is that it's Python-based. So like pretty much everything else within the OpenStack ecosystem, you're able to use kind of the same skill set carrying across there. It's also very, very powerful. Within OpenStack at the moment, we mainly use it for building HTML formatted output. But it's also able to generate PDFs. It can generate man pages, text info for anyone that still uses that. Pretty much anything you want, it's able to do it. There was also some kind of expertise within the team. So I'm a maintainer on Sphinx. That came after I started working on documentation. But we had a couple of other people within the team that had either written their own Sphinx extensions in the past or were actually involved in Sphinx upstream. And then from the actual plain markup format that we're using, restructured text, using this plain text format meant that we could use the exact same tooling for documentation as we use for code. So Gerrit for reviews, Git review, all that same kind of tooling, everything worked exactly the same. From the kind of what Sphinx offers at a deeper level, it has extensive customizability options available to it. So from the OpenStack perspective, the two things that we mainly use are the ability to customize the output by way of a theme. So we have the OpenStack docs theme, which now is also used for example, the Starling X documentation. And then we also use the extensibility APIs that it offers. So we have a really, really big amount of extensions within OpenStack alone, let alone, aside from even the things that exist outside of the OpenStack tent. Just to kind of give you an idea of how many of them we have, I'm pretty sure this list isn't even complete. There's a few of them I've surely missed, but they're pretty widespread. As for how we actually store the documentation within each project, again, as Alex said, this is done on a project-by-project basis for the most part nowadays. So this is a screenshot from Nova, and it shows kind of the typical documentation structure that we use. We break all our documentation up into things like installation guides. For service projects like Nova or Cinder or Neutron, we also have a user guide, an admin guide, config guides, this kind of thing. Depending on your project, some of these sections might be omitted because they might not be necessary. Oslo config, for example, doesn't need an admin guide. But any documentation you do have, we specify that it should fit into this structure. The advantage of doing that is we can then use that structure to guess where documentation in a specific area should live within a project. And this all gets dumped onto docs.openstack.org. So for example, the installation guides you click into the installation guides on docs.openstack.org and it will list install guides for pretty much every service project that you can think of. Another aspect to this, we also mandated how documentation should actually be built. So if you are an OpenStack project, you should be able to go in and run this particular command and it will generate your documentation for you. It's not always as easy as that. I'll go into that in a moment. There are some kind of unfortunate issues that we have around documentation, but in theory, git clone, whatever project you want, run tux, and you'll get your output. That did not display as nicely as it did on my laptop.
Sorry.
In terms of actual downsides to the workflow that we have at the moment, one of the big disadvantages is we made a decision that we wanted to make life easier for developers to actually contribute to the documentation. The disadvantage of that is that it's more difficult for non-developers to work on those same docs. So things like using Gerrit and Git and having to install dependencies if you want to build, for example, the Nova documentation, all of these serve as big barriers to entry for the less tech-minded people contributing docs. Sphinx itself as well also imposes a particular style on our documentation, namely it has to be written like a book. So Sphinx by default expects you to kind of click through documentation, so next, 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 previous to go back, as opposed to something like Mallard, which is the tool that the GNOME project use, which is topic-based documentation. So I want to do this, this is how I do it. And then because it's mostly developers that are writing documentation nowadays, developers have a quite peculiar writing style. They don't usually think about information architecture, and a lot of stuff can get assumed when you're actually writing this stuff. So we lose a bit of clarity in that aspect.
Okay, so where are we going? That's the big question, right? Like we've talked a little bit about what happened in the past and how we've got to this point, but we've still got so much more to go. Stephen outlined a couple of problems. But yeah, this bit's always hairy, but because realistically speaking, who knows genuinely what's going to change? The open source is a moving target. It's continuously moving, and we have to keep up with it. So at this point in time, the future is going to look a lot like the present. Project documentation is now firmly decentralized, and we plan to continue that going forward. We have no plans to move back, even if we accept a ton of new contributors.
We also have no intention of dropping Sphinx anytime soon. We're well aware of the disadvantages it gives us, but realistically speaking, there isn't any other tool that could meet all our requirements and then some, and do it in a way that is better than what Sphinx does. The only thing that might change here is a couple of additional Sphinx extensions, but in general, most of those have pretty much stabilized at this point, and the only time that anything significant has to change is when Sphinx starts dropping APIs and just general kind of tech debt management. We're also at the moment considering the idea of transitioning the docs team into even more of an advisory role and moving the ownership of some of those Sphinx extensions into something like Oslo. That's still kind of going through the motions at the moment, but my dream is, as my first act as PTL, to possibly kill the project and let each individual project own their own documentation entirely and only come to us when they have like very specific niche questions around documentation style or so forth.
Okay, I think that kind of sums us up, basically. We have a lot of plans. We started focusing a lot on topic-based authoring back in 2017 actually. And we still want to continue to focus on that and drive that home. But at this point in time, this is where we're at. And I think it's looking pretty good. We're still hoping for more contributors, and we'd love to have more people come and contact us and get more involved. OpenStack is incredibly complex, and the documentation doesn't happen magically, as much as we'd absolutely love it to. And as Stephen mentioned earlier, developers have a very unique writing style, which is benefited by those that professionally spend their time working to create that content.
And that is how we work with documentation within OpenStack. Thanks very much for coming, and if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Yep. Cool. Oh.
Hey guys.
Hey.
I don't know if you get this feedback a lot, but I just wanted to say that I really like the way that the system works. That the way that I can build docs. RST is really awesome because it's simple when you need it to be simple, and it can be powerful when you need the power. So I just kudos. I think the plan of the future being like the present is like just the right way to go. Don't like spend a lot of energy trying to make it better than it is, because it's really you'd be past the point of diminishing returns there. I don't know if you get this. I don't know if there's an effort to improve the performance of the Sphinx build. Okay,
Looking into it.
That's a known thing. Okay.
Yeah.
There was one other thing that I was going to mention. Oh, the docs on Sphinx. So I don't actually, when I go to look for how to do something, I don't know whether I'm landing on the Sphinx docs or the RST docs, or trying to look for an extension and I don't know I'm looking for the extension or whatever. So like they're
Also working on that.
Good. As long as these are known issues. All right, thanks guys.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's an unfortunate thing. This isn't just Sphinx. This is Hugo and actually not DocuTils, but and not ASCII doc either. But in general, documentation tools, their own documentation tends to be pretty terrible. It's unfortunate, but I'm aware of the disadvantages there, and I am working with the Sphinx community to improve this slowly but surely.
How do you deal with huge manual style documentation? Say, I don't know, how many pages is, for example, the, say, Nova documentation as a question?
How many?
Have you ever measured that? So I guess it's several...
Tens,
Yeah.
maybe, I wouldn't say hundreds, but definitely tens of thousands of lines long, and in various, depending on the docs, some of them are in various states of disrepair, but...
And that's across the board. That's not just Nova. There was things that were never quite completed when they lived in the OpenStack modules repository, because we relied so much on developer input. And that's not input that we could always get, because everyone is genuinely busy doing their own thing, right? So when we pass the documentation over, some things were not quite complete, and as a result, there are still sections, new sections, that don't get completed either. But we're trying to encourage basically the idea that if you submit a code patch that has enough of a change, you definitely submit documentation at the same time.
Okay, so this was not the original question.
Oh, sorry.
So you have a huge document, and then you have new releases. And is there a way to keep track of actually finding all the necessary parts inside the long documents that actually need to be updated? Or do you do this all manually?
This is, I can only really speak for Nova. From the Nova perspective, it is pretty much a manual process. The subject matter experts in a given area would be expected, if they changed something, changed behavior or removed something, would be expected to go through the documentation and remove or update references to that particular feature or set of features. Occasionally we do have a lot of stuff that still falls through the gaps, particularly, again, from Nova's perspective, features that have been around for a long time and kind of they've stabilized and they just happen to be there. Those docs, not all of them age all that well. But for the most part, the only thing that we do actively try and look at each cycle would be the install guides. Sit down and go through the install guides because they do change quite frequently. So things like when in Nova, when the placement service got extracted out, obviously there was a whole load of documentation that had to be rewritten for that. But the subject matter experts there went and did all that documentation rewrite. So.
And have you ever considered changing this process to some extent? So touching a document that is 100 pages long each time, twice a year when a new release surfaces is quite a lot of work, isn't it?
It is, and I have, as a case in point, there is a very large patch from me up about to do the console services in Nova, and that splits apart one of these huge documents into more topic-focused mini documents. The idea being that if you remove this part of the service, you just kill that document, and everything else continues to work. But that's information architecture.
Information architecture.
Yeah, and if you're not a tech writer, that stuff can kind of get lost. So it's
That's why we
flaky.
focus so heavily on trying to move towards topic-based authoring. It makes it a lot easier to deal with those kinds of problems. But the problem is as you've mentioned, the documents are so large at this point, it's really hard for a small group of people to dive into each individual project and pull everything out and extract it into such a way where it's a bit more dealable. But we'd love to basically change things the way they are. But at the moment, this is the best we got. And we're pretty proud of where we are, to be frank. Tons of work has gone into this, and lots of people aren't around anymore that did so much. So, yeah, if you genuinely have some good ideas on how you think we could maybe execute it, I'd really appreciate it.
Might be a rich man.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Any other questions? If not, we might call it there. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.